Welcome to the Community Engagement Center's workshop, Introduction to Email Etiquette. My name is Gina Elmore, and I am the CEC manager. We also have Aaron Thurler, the CEC assistant, who helps with programming. Our presenter, Alexandra Stokes, is a Quality Assurance Improvement Manager and Records Custodian for the University of Wisconsin-Whitewater. Please type in questions in the Q&A box throughout the session, and if time allows, Alexandra will answer these at the end. If you would like a copy of the slide deck, please type your email in the Q&A box as well. This workshop is being recorded as we are working on building a resources library. And now I'll turn it over to Alexandra. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for joining me today for this webinar focused on email usage and email etiquette. Much appreciation to Gina Elmore and her team for working on this campus training and development opportunity. My name is Alexandra Stokes, and I am the Quality Assurance Improvement Manager here at UW-Whitewater, or QAIM for short. My title just means I have a lot of different roles on campus, and one of those roles I am responsible for is serving as the custodian of records. So this means I respond to public records requests in which members of the public contact me asking to provide copies of records such as documents, reports, and you guessed it, emails. I developed this training based off of my experience handling public records requests here at Whitewater and, well, in a former life where I worked in city government, since they often entail reviewing thousands of emails to find what the requester is looking for. As I'm sure you can imagine, I've seen it all. I worked closely with Gina Elmore to develop this training to help people from a variety of different backgrounds. I will cover the following topics in today's presentation: when to use email, email content best practices, email audience best practices, maintenance. We'll go over some examples, and as Gina mentioned, questions and answers session at the end. So I encourage you all to drop any questions in the chat window as they come to mind, and we will take a look at these at the end of the presentation. With great power comes great responsibility for all my Peter Parker fans out there. So let's start with the basics. What are some pros and cons using email? So advantages. Assuming you're using it right, email is very efficient. It's quick and easy and sustainable with no paper waste. Disadvantages, of course, email can feel impersonal at times, and there is room for misunderstanding or even misinterpretation of tone, not to mention technological issues in and of themselves. I don't know if you've ever had an important email stuck in your outbox that never sent due to a poor connection or some other issue. Yeah, that's a tough one. So when to use email? The eternal question, should this even be an email? Pause before you respond to something and make sure you have processed it thoroughly. Maybe there is a more efficient or effective way to connect with the individual. For example, do you need an immediate response? Perhaps picking up the phone would be more appropriate. Do you need to have an in-depth discussion? Sometimes it's useful to set up a WebEx meeting or other video teleconferencing platform to connect with folks when you need to talk it out. Is the message sensitive in nature? So sometimes when we think of sensitive topics in this context, we're considering things like personal information, right? Social security numbers, dates of birth, etc. But it could also just be a topic that requires unpacking. So sensitive in that sense, where perhaps more context and dialogue is necessary. When is it appropriate to send an email? Emails should always be concise and purposeful. Usually, if it takes me more than 5 to 10 minutes to write an email, I like to pause and revisit my draft later in the day if it's not urgent business, of course. As an overthinker, overanalyzer myself, I find this really helpful so I can better assess what is being asked of me and can make a decision about how to address this with a clear head instead of getting caught up in the details and perhaps feeling tempted to send a 2 to 3 paragraph response. Okay, email content best practices. Salutations or greetings. It's kind of the first thing we work on when we click that create new email button. Make sure you are using the appropriate level of professionalism in your greeting and closing. One of those things is making sure you're not misspelling the individual's name. I actually experience that a lot, whether it's Alexander, Alexa, Alex, Alexis, etc. It's a little distracting and it can be interpreted as unthinking or rude or uncaring. So as someone that happens too frequently, I encourage you to double check the spelling of names before you hit that send button. Do not shorten names unless you know that's what the person goes by. Do you need to use a title? Oftentimes I will use an individual's title and last name when addressing them if it's for more formal purposes. And if you want to use a pronoun, make sure you're respecting their pronoun choices. Writing an email. Okay, I cannot stress this enough. Keep it as simple and straightforward as possible. And that includes having a clear, direct subject line. State your reason for writing as clearly as possible and be clear about what kind of response you expect. So if you're anticipating some kind of action item from the individual, make sure you pose that clear, concise way. And if you need to set up an appointment or schedule a meeting, make sure you indicate that as well. Responding to an email. I mentioned this earlier. Make sure you understand what is being asked of you. I actually did this the other day where I started to over anticipate next steps and almost missed the main question entirely. Again, I think if you're anything like me, you're very detail oriented. And while that can be a strength, it can be a challenge when we're talking about the world of email and communication. So again, if it's necessary for you to pause and reflect on your messaging, I encourage you to do that. Make sure that you're answering any questions or actions that they're reaching out to you about, right? You want to make sure you're processing each part of the email, what they're asking of you. And that's really important because sometimes in today's world, I mean, gosh, we're so busy. Sometimes I'll click through emails. And if I know I don't have the appropriate amount of time to dedicate to reading the email in its entirety and processing it, I will flag it and come back to it just to ensure that I have fully absorbed everything and, again, not wasting time with any back and forth that might come with that territory of having not read the email in its entirety. Forwarding an email. Make sure you leave the original email thread only when it's important the recipient has that background information. Oftentimes when you forward something like that, folks get the impression that it's meant for them to read the entire thread before they get to your main message. And that can waste time if it's not necessary. So again, omit the original email thread when it's not important for them to see that content. Signature blocks. So this is kind of your sign off. And I encourage folks to include an automatic signature block, because this can save you a lot of time in messaging back and forth with folks. Make sure it includes all the necessary information, including your title. If it's important for them to know where your office is located, include that in your signature line as well. Perhaps a direct telephone line for them to reach you at, because chances are if they're seeing your email, right, they already have your email address. So you may not need to include that in your signature block. Sensitive information. Sure you are aware of what is considered high risk, moderate risk, and low risk data or information. because this may influence how you choose to proceed with communicating the information at stake. So remember, emails should never be considered a secure form of communication. I mentioned this earlier, whether it's personal information such as social security numbers, credit card information, definitely avoid transmitting that over email. And this last one's interesting because it may oftentimes be an afterthought, but remember that whatever you send to people may be forwarded on to others without your permission or knowledge. So when you are focusing on writing something, keep that in mind, right? For an audience that you expect and perhaps one that you may not be expecting either. And when I say that, I mean, use a professional tone, be respectful, and things like that, which is actually a great segue into humor. As much as I love jokes and laughter, when it comes to email best practices, I highly discourage you from using humor in your messaging. It's so tricky to understand those nonverbal cues in writing when you're staring at a message on the screen. It's different from when you're having a face-to-face conversation with somebody. And as the bullet point suggests here, your humor may fall flat. It just creates an awkward situation for everyone. So make sure that you are holding back some of that humor. It's good to just abstain completely than dabble in that gray territory, because again, once you kind of start using humor in emails, it's kind of a slippery slope. Okay, before you hit send, in Outlook, there is a high priority option that you can use to flag an email as urgent. Do not overuse this. Make sure that you reserve that feature for messaging that really does require either an immediate response or is something really important that you want to call attention to. This one's really critical as well. Double check your to field, so who you're sending your message to. Evaluate it. Make sure that either everyone is present that needs to see it, or perhaps thin it out a little bit. Maybe everybody on your list doesn't need to be apprised of that. Proofreading. That's my favorite. I like to check for spelling and grammar errors before I hit that send button. They can creep up on you, especially if you're in a rush. So make sure to double check those spelling and grammar errors that may come up. After you hit send, be patient. Call if you need an immediate response. So even though email is kind of our preferred method of communication, especially with business practice, it can be kind of taken for granted that people are constantly checking and ready to respond. That may not be the case. So if it is something urgent, pick up the phone. Otherwise, make sure that you're using your emails for those mid-level happenstances where you do need assistance, but it's nothing that needs to be addressed right away. And with that territory comes the after hours emails, whether it's 7 o'clock on a Tuesday or 3 p.m. on a Sunday. Remember that not everyone checks their email outside of business hours, or perhaps they do, but just not as frequently as others. Email audience best practice. Recipients. Make sure you're sending this to the right person. Working at UW-Whitewater, we have a robust directory of employees and students. There's often duplicates with last names and occasionally last names and first names. So make sure you're sending it to the right person. Sometimes we have multiple emails for one person, perhaps their work email and their personal email. Make sure that you are distinguishing between the correct one for what you're emailing about. This best practice, I like a lot. I started using it within the last year, putting in the recipient last. So focus on crafting the content of your email first, because that's what matters most. Making sure you've got that clear message. And then last but not least, adding your recipient. So if you need to pause or revisit that email content, at least it's still open, it's a draft, and it's not like you accidentally may have pushed the send button somewhere along the way. So it reduces that human error. So the difference between to and CC, or carbon copy. So each person in the to line should be the one responsible for a response or action. And the folks who are in the CC line are not expected to respond, but should still be made aware of the conversation that's happening. Use BCC, or blind carbon copy. This is really useful when you're sending an email out to a large group of people, for example, a mailing list or list serve. Put that email list or those individual email addresses into the BCC field. This reduces the risk of a reply all mistake, which can get really annoying really quickly. For those of you who have done this before, I'm sure you know what that feels like. You may not want everyone to know who received the email. That could be another reason why you use BCC, if you want that layer of privacy or perhaps confidentiality. Or you do not want to make public other people's email addresses. So it's a really useful feature. Reply all. Use with caution, right? I mentioned this a moment ago. Only use it if everyone in the list really needs to be copied. And I know I said no humor. Here I am already messing up with a meme. Accidentally hit reply all. Not sure if I should reply all to apologize. Email maintenance best practices. Do not hoard your emails. Use the archive feature. I know at least Outlook has this feature. It will essentially move your old correspondence to a different folder, so it's not crowding your inbox. This is really helpful. And then use shared drives to transfer large files. For example, I frequently use Google Drive to share files and collaborate on items with colleagues. Now, there are plenty of other shared drive options available. I certainly don't want you to feel that this is an endorsement of any kind for Google Drive. So please do your own research to find out which platform or system works best for your needs. And last but certainly not least, we have some examples here. So for each of the following examples, I want you to consider what was executed well in accordance with good netiquette skills. And then next, I want you to identify all the epic fails. Feel free to type your observations in the chat box if you'd like. I will pause for a moment for each example and share some findings and move on to the next. So let's get started. Here's example 1. Okay, what does this even say, right? Sadly enough, this is an actual email that I've seen. It's based off real life. Yes, someone actually sent this. You email this to me. Okay, so that's a pretty obvious epic fail there. What are they saying? What's the purpose, right? Even if I were to guess at the meaning, the fact that they just emailed me to say, "Did you send me this?" is kind of silly. It's a waste of time. Now, if there was something specific about what I sent them, they had questions about, going into those details might be a little more helpful, right? And then our greeting, Jessica. I know there are lots of interesting ways to spell names, but I will be honest with you, I've never seen sick in Jessica before. Maybe this person was up late sending emails when they shouldn't have been, maybe get some rest there, spending too much time on your computer there. Double check your names, right? Make sure you're addressing the person with the correct spelling of their name. And things that this person did really well. I think the signature line here looks great. We have the name, it's clearly visible, their title, the division they work within, their pronouns are even listed, which is helpful, their email address and phone number. And it looks like that phone number is a direct line, which is really helpful. If Jessica needs to call River directly, that's how Jessica would do that. All right, example number 2. Yikes. Am I right? So email etiquette isn't just about, grammar, spelling, being clear and concise. It's about being professional as well, knowing what's appropriate to be sending in an email. Now, this is just outright gossiping, or I would argue bad behavior, that has now been, in fact, documented, right, in an email. There is a curse word used, which is indicated by the asterisks there. Not good, not what we consider good email etiquette. So one thing this person does well, their greeting seems fine, right? Hi, Jordan. But who sent this? What does that even say? Who's sending this to me? If I tilt my head a bit, I can see it says Skylar, but at first glance, it's really difficult to tell. So make sure that the fonts you're using are easy to read. Analyst 2, Department ABC. Okay, that's helpful. Pronouns. Okay, we have an extension here, which is only useful if you're emailing internally. So people within your organization who may know the first 3, right? How to get a hold of you, the area code, things like that. But if you're emailing with someone outside of your organization, that's confusing. Now they have to take an extra step to go to the website and figure out what the full direct phone number is for you. So make sure to avoid doing that. Example 3. This one's pretty obvious, right? We've all either sent or received a wall of text in an email. This one's obviously a little exaggerated, right? But it does happen. Okay, again, our greeting is fine. Greetings, Alicia. Now, Tad here, it looks like Tad used a personal email address. I'm guessing it's personal. tadisrad@gmail. Clever, but maybe not appropriate for, work. And once you disclose your personal contact information like that, I mentioned this in a previous slide, remember that this information could then be shared with other people that you may not be aware of. So once you start using things like that, it could get out and you may start receiving work emails on your personal email, which is a problem. Number one, it's confusing, right? Because now you're having to vigilantly guard your emails in that sense and make sure something didn't mistakenly go to your personal email that's urgent and for work. But if you're a public employee, you are also subject to public records law, which I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation. I'm the custodian of records for UW-Whitewater. So I handle public records requests. And once you start using your personal email for work, it becomes subject to open records law. So that can create a problem, right? Because it's really important to have a separation between personal and professional. And it's not really a great situation to be in when I have to ask somebody, hey, your personal email's been referenced here multiple times. It sounds like you might have responsive records. You need to share them. Again, for our public employees. So just keep that in mind. Example 4. Yeah, pretty obvious what's wrong here. No greeting, no salutation, no signature block, nothing like that. So our framework for our email is missing. And, content wise, yikes. Again, we have a meme. LOL reminds me of Zach. The whole gossiping thing, just highly discouraged in the workplace, let alone over email. And our last example, example 5. So this one's interesting. Let's unpack it for a minute. Okay, greetings there. The signature line or close is there, right? Jamari with his cell phone number. Maybe Jamari doesn't want his cell phone number passed around like that, especially if it's within the work context. Or maybe he doesn't mind. Either way, that's Jamari's choice. And if this were to come up in a public records request, for example, that would be something I would redact or omit or black out from the record. And I would have to cite the appropriate statute stating why that was removed from the responsive records, right? So they don't need to see Jamari's personal cell phone number. Now, the email itself is about grabbing drinks after the department meeting. Is that really so bad? No. But this is the kind of thing where people often seek guidance from me, asking, well, where do I draw the line? How bad is it for me to reach out to a colleague and say, hey, can we grab a beverage after work? In my personal opinion, I would say it's not that big of a deal. But in my professional opinion, I think this is something that really depends on the individual. How comfortable would you be with something like this being shared with others, whether it's your supervisor or, boss or friend or somebody outside of the organization. It's kind of similar to what we like to tell the kids today, our youth. It's very popular to have lots of different social media platforms, but be careful what you say, right? People may read certain things and misinterpret it, or perhaps, you put something out there that's regrettable altogether. So this one was kind of a tricky one, and I wanted to save this one for last. All right, so presentation takeaways. Reflect on some emails you've exchanged recently. These are things you can do now that you've, sat down through this webinar. These are some things you can do right away based off of what you've learned today. Are there some emails that should have or could have just been a phone conversation? What are some areas you can improve? Are there certain things that you are already doing well? Maybe there are some best practices you learned today that you plan on using going forward. And then as far as mailbox maintenance is concerned, make sure you're deleting and archiving your messages. Set up a time, once a month to go through your different file folders of your email and clean things up a bit. And make sure you update or perhaps even create your email signature if you don't have one already. And then this is where Gina gets to talk a little bit about the CEC. If you're interested in learning more and taking advantage of these types of learning opportunities like today's webinar, you can contact, well, you can contact me directly, or you can contact the Community Engagement Center. Yeah, thank you all for joining today. And Gina, thank you so much for making this possible.